Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 25% of women suffer from domestic violence at some point in their lives. Domestic violence and related offenses destroy lives and shatter families. And among the many challenges that victims face is a lack of legal representation when seeking assistance from the court system. According to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, in just one day in September 2014, domestic violence assistance programs received more than 10,000 requests for services, including legal representation, that were not met. The effect of this lack of representation is devastating. Research has shown that 83% of victims represented by counsel were able to obtain protective orders, while only 32% of unrepresented victims were able to do so. That's why in 2018, Congress stepped in by enacting the POWER Act, which requires the chief judge of every judicial district to hold an annual public event in partnership with a state, local, tribal, or domestic violence service provider or volunteer attorney project, promoting pro bono legal services as a critical way to empower survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. The Act also requires that events be held every 2 years in areas with high numbers of Native Americans and Alaska Natives, with a focus on addressing the specific issues facing Native populations. We recognize that pro bono legal assistance would not only provide critical representation in court, but it would also help provide survivors with access to services such as emergency shelter, transportation, and child care. We also recognized that legal summits mandated by the Act would raise awareness of the horrors of domestic violence and sexual assault, while inspiring others to devote their efforts to helping survivors in their communities. In addition to providing for these pro bono programs, the 2018 Act requires the Administrative Office of the United States Courts to report to Congress about each public event conducted in the previous fiscal year. The programs authorized under the original POWER Act have been extremely successful. In 2021, 73 pro bono legal summits were held across the nation, reaching more than 11,000 attorneys. In the years since we passed the POWER Act, we have amassed an army of thousands of lawyers who are helping survivors, including children, get out of dangerous situations, giving them a measure of justice and a ray of hope. But as effective as they have been, the programs created and authorized by the 2018 POWER Act are set to sunset at the end of this year. Meanwhile, the crisis of domestic and sexual violence continues. S. 3115, the POWER 2.0 Act, would ensure the continuation of the critical programs we enacted in 2018 by removing the sunset date for these programs, helping to deliver essential legal services, and to bring hope and healing to many more survivors across the country. We have already planted the seeds, and by removing the 4-year sunset provision from the original POWER Act, we will allow these pivotal programs to continue to grow and thrive, helping more and more survivors every year. I thank Senator Dan Sullivan for introducing this important and time-sensitive legislation, and the gentlewoman from Alaska, Ms. Peltola, for leading the House version of this legislation. I urge my colleagues to to join me in support of this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The POWER 2.0 Act permanently authorizes the Pro Bono Work to Empower and Represent Act, POWER, of 2018, which is scheduled to sunset at the end of this year. It requires the chief judge of each district to conduct public events to promote pro bono legal services for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. In addition, the bill requires the chief judge for a district that includes an Indian tribe to conduct a public event to promote pro bono legal services for Indian or Alaska Native victims of these crimes every 2 years. Research has shown that survivors of domestic abuse have significantly better outcomes, such as successfully obtaining a protective order when represented by an attorney. This bill will hopefully assist victims in accessing quality representation through pro bono services. I recommend that my colleagues support this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves balance of the time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, a member of the committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an enormously important initiative, and I rise today to support the pro bono work to empower and represent Act of 2021, or the Power 2.0 Act. This has to be one of the more important bills on the floor among many. This is a bill that saves lives, and I certainly want to, at the very beginning, acknowledge certainly the Senator, but as well I want to acknowledge our friend and colleague in the House and thank her so very much, Congressman Patola, for your great work that has generated something that is very close to my heart. The POWER Act is to give a lifeline to domestic violence sufferers, those who have been abused by domestic violence. As the author of the Violence Against Women Act in the House over a number of Congresses, I know how important any legislation is dealing with domestic violence and domestic abuse. I speak to law enforcement and often say to them that domestic violence calls are the most dangerous that law enforcement engage. Remember, as I started on this floor, I indicated that as Democrats, we know how to bring down crime and also engage in social justice. We understand that it is extremely important that those in the criminal justice system deserve due process. But the victims of domestic violence, more often than not women, suffer greatly. In Texas, 40.1% of women and 34% of men experience intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner rape, and or intimate partner stalking in their lifetimes. Thousands of incidents are reported every day. And on a single day in 2020, domestic violence hotlines across the country received 21,321 calls. The provision of legal services through the Southern District or through the various federal districts that train over 600,000 lawyers and then send them out to be able to give assistance to state and local government is a lifeline. It's a lifesaver. Less than 1/3 of domestic violence victims successfully obtain protective orders. Protective orders can be the cause of saving life, keeping a mother to protect her children, keeping an aunt or a grandmother. The POWER Act has had an indelible impact on the lives of the most vulnerable Americans, and I stand here in grand support of this important effort. As a former board member of the Houston Area Women's Center, I know what it means to get calls late into the night and calling the executive director and asking for relief for a woman who is running for her life. Over this past Thanksgiving weekend, unfortunately, in my own community, there was a series of domestic violence killings of women who suffered at the hands of an ex. And so it is important to eliminate the sunset of this provision and to be able to say that no one should be left alone without the idea or the help of ensuring that there is legal protection and that you have access to legal protection. Again, I want to commend Congresswoman Mary Sattler Patola, a friend and someone who I appreciate her leadership. I ask unanimous consent to submit articles in the record, and this bill must be passed. I yield back.
Without objection, so ordered. Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, is recognized.
Gentleman from New York, I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the House sponsor of the bill, a worthy successor to our late colleague, Don Young, gentlelady from Alaska, Ms. Peltola.
The gentlewoman from Alaska is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak on S3115, the Power 2.0 Act. This bill is the Senate companion to my bill of the same title, H.R. 9113. Both bills address the same flaw in our system, that survivors of intimate, partner-related violence and intimidation often lack the legal resources they need to protect themselves from future injury. In this paradigm, victims are too often unable to escape their perpetrators, often to devastating effect. Thankfully, in 2018, Congress offered an avenue to relief, the pro bono work to empower and Represent Act, sponsored by my Senate colleague, Senator Sullivan, authorized a pilot project calling for each district court to hold at least one event annually in concert with domestic violence service providers to promote pro bono legal services for victims of partner-related violence and intimidation. Additionally, to address the appalling victimization rates among Alaska Natives and American Indians in particular, the bill also mandates partnerships between district courts and tribes and tribal organizations. Since its enactment, the POWER Act has brought together dozens of service organizations and tens of thousands of lawyers, all with the aim of combating our skyrocketing rates of violence and intimidation endemic across many parts of our country. As one of my first legislative actions in Congress, I am proud to introduce the POWER 2.0 Act. This bill removes the sunset on the POWER Act and will ensure more victims have the ability to protect themselves from further violence and intimidation. I'm both grateful and filled with anticipation to see this body act so uniformly in favor of this bill, S3115, today. Mr. Speaker, I yield the floor.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized. Thank
you. Good to close? Okay. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there are an untold number of victims of domestic and sexual violence in this country, including young children, who are without legal recourse to escape their abusers, to protect themselves and their families, and to obtain the services they need to rebuild their lives. The POWER Act has started the hard work of incentivizing and encouraging thousands of lawyers to provide pro bono legal services to the victims and survivors that are most in need. But we need more attorneys to join the cause. By removing the sunset date from the POWER Act, S3115 will allow us to continue and expand the critical programs we created in 2018 while ensuring that there is no gap in access to services for those who need them. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in support of this crucial legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.